By the start of 1943, the outcome of the Second World War was already effectively decided, even though almost nobody fighting it could see that yet. There was no single battle that sealed it, no one weapon, no single mistake. What actually happened was slower and less cinematic than that. Three countries with enormous ambitions went to war against a coalition with enormously more capacity to sustain one, and the gap between ambition and capacity is where the outcome was really written. Start with the plainest imbalance, the one that gets talked about least because it isn't dramatic. Once the Soviet Union and the United States were both fighting on the same side as Britain, the countries opposing Germany, Japan, and Italy controlled a share of the world's industrial output, oil, steel, and population that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could bring to the table, even accounting for the territory Germany and Japan had already conquered. Japan had almost no domestic oil production of its own and depended entirely on shipments from territory it had to fight to hold. Germany's own coal and steel base was substantial, but nowhere close to matching the combined weight of American factories, Soviet relocated industry, and British imperial resources once all three were pulling in the same direction. An economy can win a short war on nerve and surprise. It cannot win a long one without the raw material to keep building the next tank, the next aircraft, and the next ship faster than the enemy can sink or destroy them. That distinction, short war against long war, sits at the center of why the Axis lost, because every Axis war plan depended on the fighting staying short. Germany's plan for defeating France and the Low Countries in 1940 relied on speed and audacity to win before the enemy's material advantages could matter, and it worked brilliantly precisely because it was over in about 6 weeks. The invasion of the Soviet Union the following year used the same logic on a vastly larger scale, betting that a fast enough collapse of Soviet resistance would make questions of long-term production irrelevant. When Soviet forces held in front of Moscow that December, the entire premise behind the invasion fell apart, and Germany found itself committed to exactly the kind of grinding multi-year war of attrition its economy had never been built to win. Japan made the same bet in reverse. Its planners knew they could not outproduce the United States in a long war, so their entire strategy in the Pacific depended on inflicting enough damage and seizing enough territory quickly that Washington would choose to negotiate rather than fight on. Pearl Harbor was meant to buy time for that negotiation to happen. It never did. Layered on top of that miscalculation was a second one, arguably worse. Both Germany and Japan ended up fighting wars on multiple fronts against opponents with more combined strength than either had anticipated facing at once. Germany was still unable to finish off Britain across the English Channel when it opened an entirely new front against the Soviet Union in the east, and then, within months, found itself formally at war with the United States as well after Hitler declared war in support of Japan, following Pearl Harbor. That decision is still debated by historians as one of the single costliest strategic choices of the war, since nothing in Germany's alliance with Japan obligated it. By the end of 1941, a country that had struggled to defeat France alone was simultaneously fighting the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States, three of the largest industrial and demographic powers on Earth, without ever having secured its Western Front first. Japan's own war against China had already bogged down into a stalemate that consumed enormous resources years before Pearl Harbor, meaning Japan then added a second, even larger war against the United States and the British Empire on top of a first one it had never actually won. The Allied coalition, meanwhile, did something the Axis never managed. It functioned as an actual coalition. American, British, and Soviet leaders met repeatedly throughout the war at conferences in places like Casablanca and Tehran to coordinate strategy, allocate resources, and agree on shared war aims, culminating in an early agreement to accept nothing short of unconditional surrender from Germany and Japan so that none of the three could be picked off through a separate peace. The United States funneled staggering quantities of trucks, aircraft, food, and raw material to Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. Material that kept Soviet offensives supplied with the trucks needed to move troops faster than the horse-drawn transport most German infantry divisions still relied on for the entire war. Britain and the United States pooled scientific and intelligence resources to a degree that would have been unthinkable between Germany and Japan, two allies who barely coordinated military operations across their respective theatres at all and shared remarkably little in the way of technology or strategic planning. Germany fought its war in Europe and North Africa in near total isolation from Japan's war in Asia and the Pacific, two enormous conflicts that happened to share an enemy but almost nothing else. Intelligence deserves its own mention because it is one of the quieter reasons the Allies kept winning battles that should, on paper, have been closer contests. British codebreakers working at Bletchley Park had broken major German military ciphers well before the war's midpoint, giving Allied commanders regular insight into German intentions that shaped decisions from the Battle of the Atlantic to the planning for the Normandy landings. American codebreakers achieved a similar breakthrough against Japanese naval codes, and that advantage paid off directly in June of 1942, when American commanders knew roughly where and when the Japanese fleet intended to strike and positioned their own vastly outnumbered carrier force to ambush it near Midway Atoll instead of being ambushed themselves. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk in that single battle, a loss of trained aircrew and naval air power that Japan never fully replaced for the rest of the war. Midway did not decide the war by itself, but it is a clean example of how an intelligence advantage let materially weaker forces win battles that shifted the broader balance of the conflict. From late 1942 onward, a series of battles on opposite sides of the world made the underlying imbalance visible to everyone, even though each individual battle looked in the moment like it could have gone the other way. In North Africa that October and November, British and Commonwealth forces broke a heavily fortified German and Italian defensive line at El Alamein after a hard, costly fight through minefields and dug-in positions, beginning a retreat that would eventually push Axis forces entirely out of Africa. At almost the same time, on the other side of Europe, a German army that had fought its way deep into the city of Stalingrad found itself surrounded and cut off by a Soviet counteroffensive, and by February of 1943, roughly 250,000 German and Allied troops had been killed, wounded, or marched into Soviet captivity in a single encirclement. These were not accidents of poor generalship alone. They were what happens when an army with limited reserves of fuel, trained manpower, and replacement equipment keeps fighting attritional battles against an opponent who can absorb losses and rebuild faster than the other side can inflict them. That production war only widened after 1943. American shipyards built replacement cargo vessels faster than German submarines could sink the ones already at sea, eventually launching new Liberty ships at a pace that made the entire German submarine campaign in the Atlantic unsustainable, especially once improved escort tactics, long-range aircraft coverage and better detection equipment let Allied convoys hunt the hunters instead of the other way around. American and British bombers escorted deeper into German airspace by increasingly capable long-range fighters, fought a grinding campaign against the German aircraft industry and its fuel supply that forced the Luftwaffe into unfavorable battles it could not sustain, trading experienced pilots for American and British replacements, who kept arriving in numbers Germany simply could not match. It is worth pausing on an uncomfortable truth here, one this channel returns to often. German engineers spent the war designing some of the most sophisticated individual weapons on any battlefield. Tanks with thicker armor and larger guns than anything the Allies fielded, jet aircraft years ahead of their rivals, rockets no other country had anything comparable to. None of it mattered as much as raw output. A brilliant tank that took weeks to build one at a time lost to an adequate tank built by the thousand every month, because the war being fought after 1943 was not primarily a contest of engineering elegance. It was a contest of who could put more functioning machines into the field faster than the other side could destroy them. Leadership style widened the gap further still. Early in the war, German commanders had been given real latitude to adapt plans to conditions on the ground, and that flexibility helped produce the stunning early victories of 1939 and 1940. As the war turned against Germany, Hitler increasingly overrode his own generals, refusing to authorize tactical withdrawals, even when holding a position meant losing an entire army to encirclement, treating retreat as a matter of will rather than a rational response to being outnumbered and outsupplied. That pattern repeated itself again and again in the war's final 2 years, at enormous and often needless cost in soldiers' lives. Allied leadership moved in something close to the opposite direction. Soviet strategy in the war's early phase suffered under Stalin's own direct interference, but over time command authority shifted more toward professional generals whose judgment on the ground was allowed to shape strategy, a change that showed up clearly in the increasingly sophisticated Soviet offensives of 1944. American and British commanders, answerable to elected leaders rather than a single supreme ideological authority, argued and compromised their way towards strategies that, however imperfect, generally responded to battlefield reality rather than a leader's personal conviction about how the war ought to be going. By the summer of 1944, the pressure converged from every direction at once. Allied forces landed in Normandy in June and began fighting their way across France, while barely 3 weeks later, Soviet forces launched an enormous offensive in the east that destroyed an entire German army group and drove the front hundreds of miles westward in a matter of weeks. Germany was now fighting a serious, well-supplied opponent on two major fronts simultaneously, with a shrinking pool of fuel, trained soldiers, and functioning vehicles to answer either threat, let alone both. In the Pacific, American submarines and aircraft had by this point cut so deeply into Japanese shipping that the resource-rich territories Japan had seized early in the war could no longer reliably ship oil, rubber, and metal back to Japanese factories, starving the war economy that was supposed to have justified the entire southern advance in the first place. Even with defeat now effectively unavoidable, both regimes kept fighting well past the point where continuing could plausibly change the outcome, at a horrifying continuing cost in human life. Japanese military culture treated surrender as a disgrace worse than death, a belief that by the war's final year was expressed most starkly in the deliberate use of pilots ordered to crash explosive-laden aircraft directly into Allied ships rather than accept that the war in the air had already been lost. German propaganda, meanwhile, promised salvation through vengeance weapons like long-range rockets, whose enormous cost in scarce resources and, more gravely, in the lives of the forced labourers who built them underground in terrible conditions, delivered nothing close to the strategic outcome its architects claimed to expect. Neither gamble changed the fundamental arithmetic. Germany surrendered in May of 1945, crushed between advancing armies from both east and west. Japan held out only a few months longer, and it took 2 atomic bombs dropped that August, combined with a sudden Soviet invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria in the war's final days, to convince Japan's leadership that no version of continued resistance offered anything but more devastation, with no plausible path to a better outcome. None of this means the individual soldiers, sailors, and airmen who did the actual fighting were interchangeable statistics, or that skill and courage on the battlefield meant nothing. They plainly meant a great deal, and the war was won at a cost in lives on every side that is almost impossible to hold in the mind honestly. But the deeper reason the Axis lost was not a shortage of bravery, or even, in most cases, a shortage of tactical skill. It was a mismatch between what Germany, Japan, and Italy had set out to achieve and what their combined economies, populations, and alliances could actually sustain once the war they had gambled on stayed short, turned into a war that dragged on for years. The Allies won that longer war not because every individual battle went their way, plenty didn't, but because they could lose battles and still keep building, still keep supplying each other, and still keep coordinating a strategy that outlasted whatever their opponents could throw at them. That, in the end, is a less dramatic story than any single turning point battle, but it is the one the numbers actually tell.